This is the video that accompanies the 250 cylinder challenge. If you're doing that challenge, then I'd like you to have first completed lesson 1 of Drawbox as well as the 250 box challenge. But if you're just looking for how to understand how to draw a cylinder and what the mechanics and perspective involved is, then this is the video for you. Before we can get into the actual mechanics of drawing a cylinder, however, we do have to talk about ellipses. Specifically, when I introduced you to them in lesson 1, I did tell you that ellipses represent circles. But not all ellipses actually represent circles. There's certain criteria that they have to match in order to actually be a perfect circle in 3D space. Now, if you're just drawing an ellipse floating in a completely empty scene with nothing else present against no vanishing points or anything else, you can say that it's a circle and you would not be wrong. Or more accurately, there would be nothing there to contradict what you're saying. As soon as you have other objects in that scene, however, especially objects that relate to that circle in specific ways, then it becomes more important that you remain consistent. So it's not that not all ellipses represent circles, it's more that once you say that it does, everything else has to abide by what that implies. And so we're going to talk about how you can check whether or not a circle is, or an ellipse actually represents a circle in 3D space. To do that, I've laid out 3 vanishing points and a horizon line here. We're going to use these to basically define the space that we're working in, and the circle that we're going to try and draw, which I'll tell you right now, is going to be incorrect on purpose. We're going to try and have this circle be aligned to the grid that these 3 vanishing points create. So it's going to have certain direct relationships to each of these vanishing points. So to start with, we've got these 3 vanishing points. Let's draw an ellipse that we're going to test. Now, I did explain in lesson 1 that one of these, the minor axis rather, of an ellipse. I'll just rotate this a bit. The minor axis which is this, it aligns to all the lines in the scene that run perpendicular to the surface of the ellipse. So if you remember what I said there, it's like it's shooting straight out of it. If you know anything about physics or geometry, then it's the same as the normal vector. And so this line, this minor axis, is going to go back to a vanishing point, and any other lines that are parallel to it are going to go back to the same vanishing point. Because we want our circle to be aligned to the grid defined by these 3 vanishing points, that means that the minor axis is going to at least go to one of them. If it didn't, of course, if it went to a different vanishing point, then we could at least say, if we had the freedom to, that it's still a circle, it's just not aligned to the grid. But in this case, because we want it to be consistent, we are saying it's aligned to the grid, and thankfully, our minor axis is actually going to our left vanishing point. So that's fine. That's so far so good. Next, we want to draw lines. We basically want to enclose this ellipse in a plane, and if this ellipse were actually a perfect circle, then whatever plane enclosed it would be a perfect square, which can be quite useful. But we're not going to worry about that right now, and instead we're just going to draw lines from this other vanishing point, which this the edges of the plane should converge to, and we are just going to draw it out like that. We can draw the rest of the plane by using our last vanishing point. And we're just making sure that the ellipse just barely touches the edges of this plane. So you can see that I've dragged it out and I made sure that it was bumping up against it. So it's like I'm using a ruler. And so now we have our ellipse inside of a plane, but you probably have realized by now that this doesn't really look right. Something feels off. But how do we check that it's off? And there's two simple criteria. One of them is the minor axis. So first we want to check, is that minor axis actually going to the vanishing point it's meant to be, which it is. And the only other thing that could be wrong is if we look at the specific points at which this ellipse touches the top and bottom edges of this plane, are they aligning to the vertical vanishing point? And they very clearly are not. If you were to draw a line through them, you would see that they go off in this direction. That is the second criteria. These contact points, which are essentially the points that, that touch the plane, do they align to your other vanishing point? Now, what would this ellipse look like if it was correct? So let's get rid of all of this and draw a new ellipse and do it correctly this time. The main thing, so you have two things in an ellipse that you can actually change that will impact how it actually, how the circle it represents is actually oriented in space. So you can change the orientation, which inherently changes the minor axis, or you can change its degree. So we're going to keep the orientation the same because we did want it to go to this vanishing point, meaning we wanted to keep it aligned to that grid. And we are now just going to make sure that this gets wide enough. The way that we're actually going to construct this ellipse and circle to be correct is actually a bit tricky. Because first, we want to figure out, well, where do we want this to actually fall? Let's say we're putting it around here. We'll start out by actually constructing the plane that we want. We'll construct three edges of this plane, and then we'll position the ellipse within it. And you'll notice that as we've moved it around, the minor axis here is no longer actually aligned to this vanishing point, so we do need to fix that because we want both criteria to be met. And the last criteria is we want to make sure that the points at which this ellipse touches the enclosing plane, that they align towards the vanishing point, which they don't quite yet. That seems at least closer to correct, so let's draw that out. And now we can test this. It's reasonably close. It's still not perfect, but the there. So we're still slightly off, as you can see here, but we're pretty close to correct, where this ellipse actually does represent pretty close to a proper circle aligned to the grid defined by these 3 vanishing points. Now, obviously, that was a very complicated exercise, and constructing it on the fly involved some degree of guesswork, which is why when we use this technique, we want to do our best to use a box, or at least a partially created box, to kind of start figuring this out. As you can see here, we didn't add the last edge until, like to this plane, until we figured out our ellipse. So obviously, if you were very, very set on creating accurate, precise ellipses that perfectly capture the correct degree and orientation to represent a specific circle in 3D space, then freehanding is only going to get you so far. So ellipse guides, which are little pieces of plastic that have ellipse templates cut out of them at various degrees, are very useful if you're drawing things like vehicles and other geometric objects. But for our purposes, we just want to use this technique to check how far off we were. Because similar to the boxes, we could have plotted everything back to their vanishing points, but we were trying to find the patterns in our mistakes to try and build up our kind of intuitive sense for these things. And gradually, you will improve on that as long as you're aware of the mistakes that you're making. So we're going to take this kind of principle and simplify it to a degree to at least be able to check just how far off the mark we were while we were drawing our cylinders. Just before we do that, though, I do want to reiterate exactly what I'm talking about here, and that is the criteria for the circles in 3D space. 1, we want our minor axis to go to whatever specific vanishing point we want. And the second one is we want our contact points goes to, they should align to another vanishing point. Now let's take a look at actually drawing cylinders. We're going to tackle 2 different approaches to drawing cylinders, which kind of build on each other, and they employ some of the mechanics that we've learned. So to start with, we're going to draw a cylinder just around an arbitrary minor axis, and this is going to help us get used to aligning our ellipses correctly. So first, we need to put a minor axis on the page, and it doesn't matter where it is, how long it is, or whatever, it's just, a line on the page. Next, we draw one cylinder completely on the minor axis line, and we want to draw it so that it stays aligned to this minor axis, meaning we want the minor axis to cut it into 2 equal symmetrical halves. Next, we draw the other side of the ellipse, which, same deal, we're drawing an ellipse on the right on the minor axis, so it gets cut through completely into 2 symmetrical halves. The only difference is if this ellipse were to be the end that was closest to us, the farther ellipse should always be of a somewhat wider degree. This is kind of similar to foreshortening in perspective, because it's all about the change in the visual angle at which we're, the viewing angle, sorry, that we're looking at this ellipse at. Because it changes when you're looking at it, say you're looking at, here, you've got you, and let's say you're looking at a cylinder that goes straight across, or no, let's look at one that's at an angle. the angle at which you're seeing this surface and the angle at which you're seeing this one are going to be different. This one, by virtue of being farther away, is going to give you more of the ellipse. It's going to be wider. You're going to be seeing more of that face. It'll be oriented more towards you. And the actual amount that the degree shifts is similar to foreshortening in that if it's very close to you or if it's very large, you're going to get a much larger degree shift. But if it's small, it's going to be pretty subtle, or if it's very far away. But you can basically just keep in mind that the farther end of the cylinder is going to have a slightly wider degree. And lastly, you draw your edges on either side. These are going to be converging towards the same vanishing point as your minor axis. They're all going back into the distance and they are parallel to each other. And so they will converge far off somewhere. Now, we've drawn our cylinder, and the mechanics there are pretty straightforward. But how do we check this for mistakes? This specific cylinder is more or less correct because I used this tool to draw my ellipses and to align my minor axis correctly. But when you're doing them freehand, which is how I want you to do these cylinders, it's not so easy, and we make mistakes. So let's take a look at one that I've drawn freehand and one that I've been particularly sloppy with. Well, no, it wasn't that sloppy, but I wasn't trying to be perfect. So we start off with our minor axis. We draw our top ellipse, and with your ellipses, I want you to be drawing through them. If you remember from lesson 1, I want you to do that for every ellipse you draw for my lessons. Instead of trying really hard to keep it, in one go, I want you to draw it confidently and go around the ellipse 2 full times. And as you practice this, they'll get tighter and tighter, but you'll still maintain that confidence throughout. So we've got our ellipse here, and we draw our second one. Same deal, trying to keep it aligned to the minor axis. It's of a little bit wider degree because it's the farther one. And we draw our edges. And now we want to be able to check this for mistakes. And with this, there's really one kind of mistake that we can run into, and that's whether or not our ellipses were aligned correctly. So for each one, I want you to look at it closely and identify where would the actual minor axis be. Use a ruler and a pen of a different color and actually try and look very closely and figure it out. Because we have this giant minor axis line, it can be a little bit distracting. It can be hard to see where you're wrong because this giant line is trying to insist, no, you're aligned to me, it's fine. But if we look really closely, we'll see that this ellipse here actually has a minor axis that's veering off a little bit to this side, and this one, while being pretty close, is a little bit going off to the other side. So with all of the cylinders that you do like this, I want you to ensure that you're going, once you've completed a page, that you go back over those cylinders to check their minor axes against the one that you were trying to achieve. And so every page you'll see, oh, you know what, my minor axes are tending more towards this direction, or they tend to slant in that way, and I'm getting it wrong. So on the next page, I'll try and keep that in mind. And remember, the minor axis cuts each ellipse into 2 equal symmetrical halves that could be folded over themselves. So if you cut this out and folded it over onto this, it would fall directly on top. And so that's how you identify where the minor axis should lie. It's where you can make that fold. Now, the next way that I want to talk about constructing cylinders is a little bit different. We're going to talk about constructing a cylinder inside of a box. And this is where things get difficult, because we're going to start employing a lot of the things that we mentioned earlier on, which were rather confusing, on top of the fact that our boxes aren't going to be perfect. It takes a great deal of practice, and this box itself is not perfectly correct. I can see already that this face here is slanted a little bit relative to this one. They're not perfectly parallel, but we're going to work within those confines. You can see here that to start with, I drew my box and then I drew diagonals across these two planes. So I took their corners and I drew across like this. And I did this because doing so identifies the center of the plane in 3D space. So wherever these two diagonals meet is where the center is. And I use that to identify a minor axis. Basically, it's a line that is flowing parallel in 3D space to the edges of this box. So all of them are going down to a vanishing point. Also worth mentioning, there's no guarantee this box is a cube. So keep that in mind. So the first, well, that was the first step. So I guess the second step would be to draw an ellipse within this plane here, and then another within the one down here. This is where it gets tricky because our planes are already created, and we're trying to do our best to ensure that they're aligning to this minor axis, just like the previous one, and also that they are fitting inside of this plane with the correct degree. And then, of course, we draw the edges along the sides, which themselves are going to be converging towards the same vanishing point as the minor axis. So this box already defines all of your vanishing points, or at least it implies them, because we don't have them specifically on the canvas. It's just pointing towards where these vanishing points roughly should be. So as you can see here, I'm already testing my minor axes with this red color. So we've got one coming down here, which is quite misaligned relative to all these others. And another one here, which is actually doing quite a bit better. So it's really this top one that was a problem. Next, with the contact points, which was the other criteria that we addressed at the beginning of the video. I'll just hide these lines for now. We want to test these as well, where it's actually quite tricky. We're drawing through our ellipses, and the ellipses sometimes fall a little bit off or outside of the plane, or a little bit too far inside. You know, you kind of have to get used to it. You're kind of doing the best job you can to check and identify where these mistakes are. So you can kind of find, well, the contact point seems to be around here somewhere, and it's around here, so the line would pretty much align in this direction, which should be running towards the same vanishing point as the rest of these lines here. And so here, this one is definitely falling off path. It should be more like this. And this one as well is tending towards this, I guess you could say the left side edge. And so that's helping us to identify that when I drew this, I was demonstrating a pattern of mistakes. My contact points were coming out a little bit too far to this side. So the degree tended to be a little bit too narrow, I think. And so it is still a combination of getting your minor axes correct and then getting your ellipse to sit correctly, and then also the box itself. It's more likely that the problem occurred because the box was simply too narrow and not wide enough to be a proper, for this plane to be a proper square. So this exercise where you're drawing cylinders in boxes, you're actually testing to an extent. You're using the cylinder to test your box as to whether or not this plane, or in this dimension, that it's an actual square. So this whole challenge has many dimensions to it, where we're learning to draw circles in 3D space. We're learning to estimate how what degrees and orientations they should have. We're learning to estimate the sizes of our boxes. And so these are all areas where we're learning and improving page by page, which is why we're doing 250 overall. Now, in the homework section of the 250 cylinder challenge, you'll see that I don't want you to do all 250 as, inside of boxes, and I don't want you to do all 250 inside on the arbitrary minor axis. Instead, it's going to be split up, probably 150 on an arbitrary minor axis, which is the first approach, and another 100 inside of boxes. And this is something you'll continue to practice. It's a good way to allow you to intuit how big should my boxes be given, a certain kind of foreshortening and, focal length and whatnot. And how can I gauge what size, what degree, what orientation these ellipses should be to properly fall into the realm of being pretty close to a circle. This video has definitely gotten pretty long, and I'm going to leave it at that. As always, check the notes, links in the description. Videos are great and all, but it really helps to be able to go through that material at your own pace.